Thank you very much for being here this morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in the panel this morning here. It's a pleasure for me and an honor really to be here at a university that for the last 5 decades in the German context was the place to be, or maybe as it wasn't sure if the place existed at all, the place to have a look at in terms of theory building and the development of social theory and theories of society in Germany. So it's a real honor and a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you as well for using a photograph of mine in the brochure that suggests that time didn't pass in the last 2 decades. I really look bright and smart on this photo. So, thank you very much. My talk is about world systems theory and beyond. And in order to ease a little bit the atmosphere of solemnity this morning, I integrated some pics, some crumbs of pop culture in the titles of the slides. So if you aren't too much interested in the topic or in the theme or in what I'm talking about, you can have a thought about what is this about and who was it who invented this title. Is this burning an eternal flame? The strange non-death of methodological nationalism. And as we are discussing in the public debate in Germany in these days, questions of intellectual property, I have to admit that the subtitle, The Strange Non-Death of Methodological Nationalism, is adapted by a book by Colin Crouch, The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. So why is it that methodological nationalism is alive and kicking after, I would say almost half a century of critique? The critique of methodological nationalism is, I would say, I would claim, almost as old as Bielefeld University, or arguably it is even older than Bielefeld University. I would remit you only to some modern classics of the critique of methodological nationalism, for example, Anthony Smith's paper on nationalism and social theory, published back in 1983 in the British Journal of Sociology, or in the German context, there's an important paper by Friedrich ten Broek, the title of which was Emil Durkheim oder die Geburt der Gesellschaft aus dem Geist der Soziologie, Durkheim and the birth of society out of the spirit of sociology, published back in 1981. So even in the German context, 3, 4, maybe 5 decades of critique of methodological nationalism, and still my argument will be that it is still quite alive in theory building, not only in the German context. One of the main arguments of the critique of methodological nationalism is put forward by several papers authored by Andreas Wimmer and Nina Glick-Schiller. Here is one of the central quotations of the position they take towards methodological nationalism. The epistemic structures and programs of mainstream social sciences have been closely attached to and shaped by the experience of modern nation-state formation. So this is the basic tenet they claim, and they say this epistemic structure and program of mainstream social sciences has, in the sense of methodological nationalism, has 3 dimensions in a sense. They call them ignorance, naturalization, and limitation or territorial limitation. So, in a sense, ignorance They relate ignorance to grand theory, so classical sociological theory, and in the evolution of social theory until the late 20th century, there was an ignorance, an invisibilization of the national character of theory building and of an ignorance of the context in which theory building, sociological theory building takes place, which is the nation state and the world differentiated into nation states. Naturalization was the critique they referred to with regard to empirical studies. So empirical studies take for granted discourses, agents, agendas, institutions as being framed by national histories of society. So in empirical research, nationalism is in a sense naturalized and invisibilized in a sense as well. And the third critique is directed at studies of nationalism and state building specifically, and they say there is a limitation, so there is the container model of society. Empirical studies, historical studies of nation-state building have a look at nation-states and their history, single nation-states, and not on the relations between them. So, in a sense, ignorance, nationalization, and territorial limitation are pretty much alive, would be my argument. How can I... Sorry, I don't know how to invisibilize this sign there. So containerizing social structures and endogenizing, in a sense, social developments is still common practice in the social sciences until today. And obviously, methodological nationalism has, in this sense, a life after death. And the battle cry of sociology in theory and empirical practice is right or wrong, my country study, my country data, my country history, or the epistemic tradition of my country. So there's a deeply entrenched methodological nationalism in theory building and in empirical studies which refer to social theory building up to the present, until our days. There is a critique of methodological nationalism that is older than, for example, Wimmer's and Glickschiller's critique, or than the paper by Anthony Smith, or than the work of Ulrich Beck, for that matter, who in his methodological cosmopolitanism also had integrated a critique of methodological nationalism. There's a systematic perspective criticizing and transcending methodological nationalism, and this systematic perspective is the one I will be referring to in my talk, and which builds the context of the talk, and which I will try to transcend in the later slides. Methodological nationalism was severely and systematically, that's the main point, criticized and challenged by Immanuel Wallerstein, or Wallerstein if you want it, and world systems theory. We could debate later on the topic that this was done at a time and in maybe a strange collision with Luhmann's theory of world society. So we could think about how they two relate to each other in a sense of criticizing methodological nationalism from very different points of view. So Wallerstein is the central player, I think, in this game of critique and of transcending methodological nationalism. And in the introduction to his first main work on world systems theory, volume 1 of The Modern World System, published back in 1974, in the introduction, Wallerstein reconstructs how he came to view the world as a world system, or as a plurality of world systems, or an historical process of changes in world systems. And he says it was at this point of his intellectual biography, that I abandoned the idea altogether of taking either the sovereign state or that vaguer concept, the national society, as the unit of analysis. I decided that neither one was a social system, and that one could only speak of social change in social systems. Neither one was a social system, and change is proceeding within social systems. This is adopting and claiming for a relational perspective on social phenomena. So in systems, you have relations between the positions and positionings in the structure of the system. And he said it's not nation states and not society as a vague concept, but it's in systems, in social systems where people or agents or institutions have to be located, and it's the relations between people, agents, institutions in a system, the relations that matter in a sense. And the only social system then, he's claimed, in this scheme, in his scheme of systemizing social phenomena and social relations, the only social system in his scheme was the world system. So I think some of you, maybe all of you, may be acquainted with the basic tenets of world systems theory. I only want to mention three important dimensions and stances world systems theory takes. So the first one, as I have already said, and what is at the core of world systems theory is the idea of transcending the nation-state perspective and shifting the unit of analysis, from the nation-state to the world system. And the world system with hyphen, world system, because it's not the world that is the system, but it's a system that is a world. So there may be several world systems in historical time, and there may be several world systems at a time as well. So they are extending into the world, and they are a world of their own. They build a structure of positions and positionings of their own, and that's why it's not only the global world which is important here, but there may be several worlds of world systems on the globe at a specific point in time. So shifting the unit of analysis to the world system, then adopting the concept of time-space, so the interrelatedness of time and space and social processes proceeding in time and in a certain spatial context. And there's then the differentiation of different spatial times of world systems that come into being, that then adopt a normal procedure of processing in time that may be for a longer or a shorter period of time in the historical time, and then times of structural crisis, of bifurcation of world systems, and of possibly the demise of world systems. So there's an imagery of rise and fall of world systems in a long durée perspective. And the third basic tenet, or the basic principle, the fundamental epistemological principle of world systems theory is transcending disciplinarity, and not meaning only transcending the differentiation of different academic disciplines, history, sociology, political science, anthropology, but in a sense transcending the epistemology that rules the world at the time when world systems theory was developed, and which rules our times as well. So the dominant epistemology guiding social sciences, the differentiation between natural sciences, human sciences, for example, the structures of knowledge, the established structures of knowledge in social sciences, this was what was challenged by world systems theory, and in a sense, world systems theory, sensu Wallerstein, challenged positivism, orthodox Marxism, statism, and culturalism at a time. So there were on the other side of the medal, there were strong critiques against world systems theory from positivist positions, from orthodox Marxism and statism and culturalism and so on. I won't go into this because I don't have the time for it, but in a sense, it is an approach that falls between the cracks and which, on the other hand, has, I wondered during the morning lecture if world systems theory is big theory, deep theory, or wide theory. I think, in a sense, it is big or grand theory, and I would argue that we need not only wide theory in the sense of much, lots of theory building, but I think we need maybe several, but we need a offer of meta-theoretical thinking and positioning of empirical practical research. And I think it's not only, sociology shouldn't be only about lots of theory and then eclectically combining them, but I think sociology lives off a certain sense of macro-theoretical and meta-theoretical theory building, and world systems theory was one offer in this field of macro or meta-theoretical argumentation. What I'm interested in is the sociology of social inequality, and if you approach the sociology of social inequality in the sense, from the perspective of a world systems approach, then I think you see much more and to see different things than not approaching social inequality from this perspective. The relational approach, I call it, an approach that, in a sense, locates positions in wider structures and processes in wider process structures. And probably, I don't want to offend anyone in this room or at this university or in the scientific community, but I would claim that probably the single most important book in the 21st century social sciences, it's only 19 years so far, the single most important book, it was authored and published by Roberto Patricio Korzeniewicz and Timothy Patrick Moran, so an Argentinian and a US sociologist, both working in the US, and back in 2009, 10 years ago, they published a book entitled Unveiling Inequality, a World Historical Perspective. And in the introduction to this book, the two authors claim inequality and stratification have been conceived primarily as processes that occur within national boundaries. Such a focus has produced a number of influential overarching narratives. This book calls these narratives into question. Like Wallerstein calls certain narratives about the development of states, nations, markets into question, Korzeniewicz and Moran claim to call into question certain influential narratives. And maybe the most influential in the field of social inequality and the sociology of social inequality is the narrative that the relative well-being of people is shaped most fundamentally by the capacity of homegrown, so national, institutions promoting economic growth and equity. So well-being of people directly and indirectly related to a national context and institutional configuration and the agency of institutional actors in a national configuration. These are the actors who produce or don't produce well-being, equity, more or less inequality in a societal context. And so if you read the not local but national newspaper, the most important in Germany, today front page Deutsche Wirtschaft wächst leicht. So German economy grows slightly. Why is that important? Because the well-being and the structural inequality of the German population is directly linked to German growth. So if German economy grows, the supposition is that there will be more prosperity, more options, more possibilities for consumption and possibly more revenues for diminishing somewhat social inequality. And if there's not growth, then all these potential options are closed. So the supposition in the narrative that the German economy grows or doesn't grow is that there are national actors, the government in the first place, but firms, unions, workers, the population itself, that drive growth or non-growth in history, and that the distribution of growth or non-growth then ensues in a national context. And Korzeniewicz and Moring challenge this notion. From a world historical perspective, the world systems, world historical perspective challenges common established narratives. For example, in the sociology of social inequality, by focusing on the interactions, the relations, the dynamic relations, the interactions of national, only supposedly, allegedly national institutional configurations and developmental paths in space and time. So they relate allegedly national structures and developmental paths in the world system, allegedly national configurations of social inequality. They relate them to each other and say we can't understand allegedly national structures of social inequality without at the same time looking at other allegedly national structures of social inequality and without having a look on the global or world system configuration of social inequality. So I can't go into detail here neither, but I only want to give you a sense of how they proceed, of how they operate with their arguments. So on the one hand, they try to reinterpret within the notion of within-country inequality. And they, using household panel data for almost 100 countries over a large period of time, they construct two clusters in the world system. There are two clusters of countries, clusters with a high inequality equilibrium over time, equilibrium over a long period of time. And they claim from the mid of the 19th century until the end of the 20th century, we have a cluster of countries which have, on the one hand, low income, so low gross domestic product per capita, low income, and high inequality. A stable cluster, an equilibrium of high inequality in certain parts of the world, and we have a country cluster with the opposite configuration, high income, high prosperity, and relatively, as measured against the other country cluster, relatively low inequality. So two clusters, and if you have a look only at one country or one country of one cluster, then you will see, oh, there is high prosperity, there is certain rates of growth across time and even today, high prosperity and low inequality. But if you don't relate this cluster and this configuration of high prosperity and low inequality to the other cluster that has been stabilized over a long period of time in the world system, a cluster of other countries configured as low income and high inequality, then you won't understand why there is at all the possibility for certain country clusters to stabilize their configuration of high prosperity and low inequality. So you have two country clusters, two equilibria, and these equilibria are intertwined, interlinked in a sense. And that's what the second dimension of the analysis is claiming. They reinterpret between country inequality by identifying a high inequality equilibrium on the world scale. So we have allegedly national configurations which have to be related analytically to other national configurations, and on the world systems level, you see there is over a long period of time, since the mid of the 19th century until at least the late 20th century. There's an equilibrium of high inequality worldwide. So you have prosperous economies and societies on the one hand, and you have poor countries and societies on the other hand. You have high inequality in the poor countries, you have low inequality, relative low inequality in the rich countries, and this configuration is interlinked. You can't understand the one without the other. That's the idea. And any national social structural analysis of whatever is missing, in their perspective, the point that this national configuration is linked historically, dynamically, and structurally to other configurations in the world system. So that is the central idea. And then they argue not in sense of a Marxian explanation, in the sense of exploitation, so the rich countries exploiting the poor countries, and by that relation stabilizing a high inequality equilibrium on the world scale, but they argue more in the Weberian sense. So social closure, monopolization of resources and exclusion of others, the closure of markets and the closure of the realm of political rights, and some countries profiting from this social closure and others then lagging behind. So what is theorizing contemporary society about? This is the theme of our session today. What is it about in the specific perspective of theorizing about social inequality in contemporary society? It's about rethinking inequality as a social relation. Inequality is always a social relation, and you may say, well, it's trivial, yeah, but it's not really integrated, I think, in the mainstream theorizing and researching on social inequalities. Inequality is always a social relation, and we have to locate positions within a structure of social inequality on a world systems scale, and we have to relate positions in the structure to other positions in the structure. And the dynamics between, the interaction between these positions is a central part of the history of the development of social inequality, not only on the national level, but on the transnational world systems level. So theorizing society is, this is my claim for this session, is an exercise in locating social structures within, you may say, larger structures. I would say relating structures to other structures. It's an exercise in relating structures and relating processes, or dynamic structures located in time and space, which are related to other dynamic structures in time and space, in earlier time or in other places. So this is what theorizing society is all about, and I think then society is a concept that not only gets fluid, but which gets dynamic in a sense. And while this orientation, obviously, I would claim, goes against the grain of mainstream sociology, or better, the mainstreams of sociology, because I don't think there is a homogeneous single mainstream sociology. You can read this. Charles Tilly claims this: at least in Western countries, people learn early in life to tell stories in which self-motivating actors, firmly located in space and time, produce all significant changes in the situation through their own efforts. So Charles Tilly says that is the common sense, that is a hegemonic narrative. And this narrative is not only about methodological nationalism, but about methodological individualism. So it's the own effort of people or of nations that they get to a certain place in the structure of inequality, in a system, in a systemic structure. Narratives feature essences, not bonds. So narratives feature entities and not relations. This is the claim, and the critique would be exactly that you have to take into account relations between entities. They therefore favor individualistic analysis where the rational choice, phenomenological or otherwise relational analysis of inequality affront narrative common sense. And that's why they are not at the center of social theorizing and the practice of social research in the field of inequality, but they are, you will find them more at the margins. But, and this is, I only have one more slide, I guess, but the important thing is that a world systems and world historical perspective as a relational perspective today, at the beginnings of the 21st century, in my eyes, has to be, well, transcended as well, or has to be reoriented. So the relational orientation of world systems theory and of a world historical perspective has to be reoriented today as well, in the sense of adding a world ecological perspective, which was conspicuously absent in the 1970s, 80s work of Wallerstein and world systems theorists. You may say not by chance, but anyway. So adding a world ecological perspective and criticizing not only methodological nationalism and methodological individualism, but criticizing also methodological fossilism. That would be my point. Today, social analyses of social inequalities, well, in a sense, invisibilize and take as natural the energy regime and the resource regime, be it poor societies or rich societies, are based upon. So there's not only an invisibilizing of the national histories and the national structures of specific positions in the world system. It's not only an invisibilizing of relations, but there's an invisibilizing of the ecological preconditions and consequences of certain agents who take certain positions in a structure of inequality. So adding the world ecological perspective or dimension to world systems theory would be, in my eyes, the thing to do when working with world systems theory or in a world historical perspective. And this is what I am trying to do as a personal note, only my 5 cents to world systems theory or world historical theory development. This means unveiling inequality. Unveiling inequality for Kozaniewicz and Morin meant unveiling the relations between different positions in a structure of inequality. Not taking the position as an individual position, but relating this individual position to other individual positions, and then you have a network of social inequalities. And in this sense, my claim would be that we, the rich countries, early industrialized countries of the West, of the global North, have never been democratic. This is an adaptation from Bruno Latour, obviously. We have never been democratic in the sense of never having a real democracy in the sense of integrating all people that are living on the territory of a politically defined society, not having all the people integrated into the right to shape their own conditions of life. That would be, for me, what democracy is about. And then I would make the argument that within countries and between countries, there are many restrictions to democracy and to the, well, influential narrative of this society being democratic, other societies being not. So class and status as social relations. The social relations of class and status are processes of exclusion and inclusion in terms of democratic rights in this society, within the society. So we would have to have a relational look on class and status relations and their dynamics in order to see who has the possibility to claim democratic rights in a democratic society and who has not. And on the between-country level, we would have to focus on exclusion, and exclusion in the sense of Korzeniewicz and more, and so which countries, which populations, which non-citizens have been excluded on the world systems level from the democratic rights a country is guaranteeing to its own citizens, who is non-citizen and hasn't the possibility to enter the range of social and political rights. And between countries, it was mentioned, I would claim that there's a relation of externalization, so of living at the cost or at the expense of others, of proceeding and processing in a structure of social inequality and producing negative trade-offs and externalities to others. So the modern configuration of relational inequalities is configured around class, status, exclusion, and externalization relations, with class rule on the national and on the world systems level being mediated and stabilized by market competition, status, citizenship rights, exclusion, and the expropriation of nature, externalization. But, and I will end with this, but on the basis of this, well, contemporary theorizing of social inequalities, there is a bit of, if you want so, diagnosis of the present in this analysis, inherent to this analysis, because I would say, if we talk later about the relation between social theory or theorizing society and diagnosis of the time of contemporary society, then I would say the times, they are changing, and as the 21st century is progressing, the limits to the limitation of democracy become increasingly clear. That would be my diagnosis of the time, based on world systems, world historical and world ecological tenets. I would say social polarization, hyper-consumerism, forced migration, and climate change all point to the emergence of a transformational time space. So we are living in a time space which is transformational because the relational structure of inequalities is changing. And we are witnessing this change in the structure of relations of social inequality. So that's it. But 1 minute only, because I don't want to end without honoring Immanuel Wallerstein, who passed away some weeks ago on August 31 of this year. And I will only read, and this is about the normative implications, which should be possibly at a debate here as well. This is about this quote from his 1974 work, is about the normative implications of a world systems, world historical, and I would say world ecological perspective, and I will only read that. Man's ability to participate intelligently in the evolution of his own system, I would say that is democracy. Participating intelligently in the evolution of his own system is dependent on his ability to perceive the whole, the totality, you could say. The more difficult we acknowledge the task to be, to perceive the whole, the more urgent it is that we start sooner than later. It is, of course, not in the interest of all groups that this be done. Class, status, exclusion, externalization, not all groups have the interest in adopting a perspective on the whole of social structures of inequality. Here, our commitment enters. It depends on our image of the good society. To the extent that we want a more egalitarian world and a more libertarian one, we must comprehend the conditions under which these states of being are realizable. To do that requires, first of all, a clear exposition of the nature and evolution of the modern world system heretofore and the range of possible developments in the present and the future. So, theorizing society and diagnosing the present and possibly the future. That kind of knowledge would be power. And within the framework of my commitments, Wallerstein says, it would be a power that would be most useful to those groups which represent the interests of the larger and more oppressed parts of the world population. Thank you.